Hi. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Is my camera's not working though?
I don't see you. I can hear you, but I
Okay.
can't see you.
Figure that out. Huh, not now, huh? Oh, that's weird. Okay, let me do something then. I'm reading called Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World by Girard, which is really just interviews and very short essays. And again, that expository clarity is very much on display there. Not to mention, I want to start reading as we proceed. I know that can be annoying for people when you're sort of overwhelmed with things to read. But for me, it's always really helpful to just read as much secondary literature as I can on something. It just makes me feel like I have I can sink my teeth into the text a little bit better. So I hope that's okay. For example, I'm reading Gillian Rose's, incredible critique of Girard and Thomas Mann in The Broken Middle, and you might find it very interesting actually, because Girard, it's about Girard's Hegelianism and the extent to which he is or is not a Hegelian. And I think you'll find that quite interesting on the kind of really the aspect of Hegel that Girard is tethering with is obviously the famous Lordship and Bondage section and the phenomenology. And obviously Girard will famously make the claim that Hegel misunderstood something about the primal struggle, and that it's ultimately around the attainment of an object which doesn't dissipate. And this will lead Gillian Rose to make a beautiful claim, which is that we should read Girard as a Gnostic, which I think is quite nice. Anyways, let me just stop there and turn it over to you guys, just briefly kind of say hello and say who you are and what you're interested in Girard and so on and so forth. So maybe we could start with let's see, Kubrick at the top.
Yeah, so my name's Ben Meyer. I'm a licensed counselor currently in the state of Ohio, although I just recently moved to Phoenix, Arizona. I used to live here. I lived here for a little bit. And I have an interest in psychology. That was kind of my undergrad major. I went to Ohio State and ended up being interested in philosophy also. So like Nietzsche really piqued my interest. And I ended up just getting a master's degree from Louisiana State in philosophy. And that's really helped get me to sort of this point. So I'm really interested in psychology, psychoanalysis, philosophy, and certainly critical theory, critical aspects of literature and things like that. So I'm very much interested in Freud. I've gotten a lot more into him lately. I definitely see the resemblance here with Girard as a writer, very articulate, descriptive, and thorough. And so I'm interested in the subject matter. I'm interested in violence and sort of, I think, how we fundamentally misunderstand it. And so I'm interested in different interpretations to try to make it understandable. That's kind of where I'm coming from.
Awesome. Duncan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, I'm Duncan. I'm a master's student at the New School for Social Research, but due to global conditions, I'm currently based in Australia. I'm reading Hegel at the moment. I actually have to leave in about 50 minutes to go log into a lecture on Hegel. So there's a bit of interest between this like Girard Hegel thing. I've been interested in this tech for ages. I, used to do this thing where I'd buy anything with a cool book title. If a book had a cool title, I'd buy it, which is how I came across Girard. I was like, oh, violence. Young man, I love violence, right? But I just had a friend who just over the past 6-12 months has done a big deep dive into Girard and says it's like incredible. He's read like 4 of his books in a row. So I figured this was a good chance to finally read this book I bought like half a decade ago. So yeah, that's why I'm here.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Chaim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Nice to be with you. I'm Chaim. I'm in Los Angeles. And at the moment, I'm mostly concerned with questions of psychoanalysis and mysticism. And that's been my area of study for a long time. And yeah, I hope to do some good work together.
Thank you. And then to Levi, if you don't mind.
Hi, I'm Levi. I am currently a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley in medical anthropology. And for my qualifying exams, I wrote, one of my essays was on Bataille's understanding of sacrifice and violence. And I wanted to read Girard, but did not have the time or space to do so. So this is really great timing for me, actually. And so I was really interested in Bataille's notions of sacrifice and its relation to both violence and eroticism. And I live and travel with Central American migrants. That's what I do for my ethnographic project. I'm also really interested in the idea of how modern notions of sacrifice, especially in relation to the nation or the state, are evoked specifically in relation to migrants, and how the question of the migrant always seems bound up in sacrifice in some way. So I'm really excited for this.
That's amazing. Thank you. And then, sorry, I don't know your full name. Is it A.L.? A.L., could you say hello? Or perhaps Joe, if you could say hi.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know if I can no longer be seen, but I'm interested in Girard for like several different reasons.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
what's
no.
that? Oh, do we have AL now?
You can continue, Joe. It's all good.
All right. Well, anyway, one of the main ones was maybe some of you have heard of it. Peter Thiel wrote a sort of well-known piece that drew heavily on Girard, and it had to do with the threat of international terrorism, kind of the difference between people who have a fixed set of beliefs that they're committed to unconditionally, and other civilizations like ours that, and then there was reading about Girard after that. And I'm interested to get into like the nitty gritty of Girard, because I've noticed browsing around online, a lot of people who like Girard seem to be able to just kind of reference shorthand stuff for Girard that I don't know. I don't like it. I don't like it when it sounds so, I don't like the big wet blanket kind of version of these big theories. So I kind of want to hear like people who know about it talk.
Cool. A.L., would you like to go?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Ari. I live in Europe. I live in Italy. I read a lot of theory, but now I am going.
A.L., you're breaking up a little bit. Maybe you could chat in the chat. Tell us your first name.
Hey, I think I had a little problem.
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe without the video, wait. Hey, my name is Ari. I live in Italy.
Ali, okay.
I'm studying. Yeah, I'm studying a little bit more about theory now because I'm helping to write some projects for my party, and I wanted to make something deeper. But normally I read a lot of political theory like Zizek and Fukuyama.
Mm-hmm.
I study like art, so I'm not really into the academics. Very sincere.
Cool.
That's it.
Okay, thank you for being with us. And then I think Sean.
All right, so I'm Sean. I'm a psych undergrad student, but I've taken several philosophy courses, one of them from you, the Intro to Existentialism.
Oh yeah,
And
absolutely.
so I just have a somewhat of a passing interest in a lot of it, and some of the subject matter concern in this relates a lot to my major. It sort of bridges the gap between the two, like a lot of the other reading I've been doing outside of the things assigned for the classes I take. So it just seemed like a very interesting subject, and I wanted to know more.
Very cool. Excellent. Awesome. And then Cade, if you want to introduce yourself quickly, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Cade, I'm from the Scranton area of Pennsylvania. I go to the GCAS Global Center for Advanced Studies right now, and with a focus on the work of Alain Badiou, and particularly its potential application to juggalos. But I've known of René Girard for a while, and Violence and the Sacred has been like on my list for a bit. So I was pretty excited to see this group coming about.
Nice. Okay, great. Let me share my screen. I must confess I'm a little hesitant to restart my computer, which would create the video like working or whatever, because I've taken a bunch of like little notes and highlights on the text, and I'm afraid that like if I do the restart, then I'm not sure it's going to save everything that I did. One of those sort of deals. So
you can save the PDF, no?
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, it looks like it is saved. So hopefully I can like close this down. It says that it's saved. And give me 1 second. Yeah, hold on 1 sec. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so let me do that so we can sort of see one another. I think that would be much more ideal. But that does mean that I'll be back with you guys in, I don't know, like 5 minutes. Perhaps in the meantime, what you guys could discuss is a little bit about your own just sort of take on reading the first chapter. I mean, one of the things that is really nice about the first chapter is you'll notice straight away that a pandemic is referred to as a sacred event, straight out. I think on page 31. And so it all of a sudden becomes quite relevant. And I couldn't help but recognize so many immediate associations with questions of like the proletariat, or questions of, okay, so victimology, like how precisely are we theorizing the status of a victim today, right? So it's so rich. So let me leave you. I'll pause. Oh, cool. All right. Okay, we're recording. All right. Sorry about that delay, y'all. Well, let's hold on the Hegelian question, because it does come up later in this notion of the triangularization of desire.
Okay.
So I think we've all, or maybe most of us, have read Hegel's Lordship and Bondage in the Master-Slave Dialectic. This will, I think, be our main. I mean, it's very interesting. You take dozens and dozens of philosophers who don't quite read Hegel, but they have certainly read that chapter, and then you call them Hegelians. I don't know if that's a fair summary of I don't know if that qualifies them to be Hegelians or to elevate to the level of Hegelian. But nonetheless, people call Girard that. And yes, and I think Gillian Rose, probably the most formidable Hegelian of our time, although she died in the 1990s, really has a nice take, I think, on placing Girard's Hegelianism, which we can read later.
Okay.
So let me now share my screen with you. Hopefully this document's saved. Any other comments while I bring it up are welcome, please.
Oh,
I'm
Please.
go first.
okay. I had a question. You talked about identification and a kind of blurriness with regards to Freud's sexuality. And that was from related with the Borg-Jakobson piece.
Mm-hmm.
And today you added the death drive is also missing in Girard.
Yeah.
And is that's your own thing, or are these two things?
Yeah, that's my own intuition. But as I've mentioned before, I have I fully confess that I'm not a Girardian, so this is all like fresh terrain for me. It very well may be that Girard provides an account of the Freudian death drive, which may or may not be compelling. As I understand it, he does not, because there are prior problems for Girard around the theory of the psychoanalytic subject, which he will reject. So we'll see, though, as we progress in this study group. I mean, I think I would like to progress in this study group in such a way where we keep a lot of things open, and meet several times, so that we can really sink into this literature. That's my vision. I have bad news, though, which is what I feared did happen, which is my PDF didn't save all of my highlights. So they're sent to the void. That's okay. I think we can still proceed through the text. I had a feeling that might happen. We can still proceed in sort of, I will remember, since I just was reading it today, some key passages to point to. We can kind of highlight and so on and so forth. So let me do that now. But yeah, I mean, in terms of meeting and so on, I think we should meet. Oh yeah, just as an FYI, for those of you that are doing like prior COVID sessions with me on various texts, I hope to have a new announcement of a really exciting seminar series offered by a Lacanian, an American Lacanian who's sort of senior. I won't give her name right now, but it could be very exciting. And we'll see. It may be on topology. So those of you that are interested in Lacan, that may be my next little project. Just as a heads up.
I was going to mention.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, a follow-up comment and a question. We'll get. I guess we'll return to it. But this piece by Borg-Jakobson.
Yes.
I'm not clear about. I guess we can come back to it later. But he sees a contradiction in Girard, right? That Girard seems to have a different understanding of sexuality, coming more from identification than from desire.
Exactly. Exactly.
But yeah, so I guess I'm finding it hard to locate that in Girard.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can see this in the argument of Medea that Girard presents in this first chapter on sacrifice. For Lacan, the idea of Medea's heroism, Lacan says that Medea is the pinnacle, the paradigm of woman, right? It's like feminine jouissance, if there ever was such a thing. For Girard, he does not ground the actions of this figure vis-a-vis sexual difference. It's not of interest to him. In some sense, it's like following her actions, follow a logic of sacrifice, like kind of like qua-sacrifice. We can look at that when we get there. So yes, I think if you read Borg-Jakobson, you'll be very clear. It's very clear that part of what's being rejected in Freud and in psychoanalysis is, might we say, the primacy of the sexual drives, right? I think that's very obvious. And it just so happens that I believe it is chapter 4 or 5 that's on psychoanalysis. So let's see, it's chapter 4 from book 3. Yeah.
And that kind of leads into what I was going to kind of throw out there is, it seems to me that Lacan follows from Freud, but is different than Freud in some pretty significant ways. And that seems to go along with some of what Girard, I think, is pointing to here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, I honestly think that it would behoove all of us, considering that there's no foundation that would ever give a grant to somebody to go study, I don't know, like Alain Badiou and like communist politics, or even like I don't know, like obscure things of Lacanian theory. However, there are a number of Silicon Valley foundations that would offer you grants if you wanted to look at, like, I don't know, like
Heidegger.
Market theories of mimetic desire and so on. And so it's, I think somebody mentioned that Peter Thiel earlier. To me, that's what has prevented me from confronting Girard, is the fact that his followers or his disciples tend to have that political valence. That really bothers me. I mean, if you look at things hidden since the foundation of the world, you'll notice that Girard completely negates Marxism as a false conception of the logic of surrogate. And I'm sorry, of scapegoating, right? And so there becomes a sense in which, if you're like, let's say a 1% ultra wealthy Silicon Valley person, you can see quite easily why Girard's theory will help you, precisely because it mitigates or fortifies critique of your success as, oh, well, I'm just a scapegoat. Oh, yeah, right, you see? So therefore I can pacify my critics. There's a certain, I think, let's call it vulgar logic of what attracts, I think, Girard to. And then I think the other thing is, and then we should be honest here, is that the Girardian theory of mimetic desire and mimetic contagion actually probably does explain a lot about contemporary capitalism, right? I mean, that's just, I think, a fact. And I think that is something we should attend to, right? For however much there is something about that that makes our skin crawl, for however much that may be the case. Anyways, and I think you should all buy this book here too, as a companion. Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. I can provide a PDF of it as well, because it's in this one where it's all laid clear, like, you know, and it's a kind of a, like, he gets into all of these like, he has a whole thing on Beyond the Pleasure Principle in there. So like this whole question of Girard and death drive, like we can answer that if we read it, right? Okay, so let's start the text, unless there's any other comments.
I just wanted to say I'm very interested. You wrote in the email that you want to read this with religion, and I'm very interested to hear what, you know, how that happened.
Well, yeah, even if I didn't want to, it would still be necessary, because obviously his claim is that a religious organization, like the Japanese philosopher Kojin Karatani gives us like a similar, highly abstract theory about what forms a religion. And for him, it is a mode of exchange that's based on reciprocity, right? For Girard, it is pure and simple, a kind of a mastering of the impulse of constitutive violence, and a kind of a fundamental nonviolence is at the foundation of all religions, right? A fundamental commitment to nonviolence, but not nonviolence in this kind of Martin Luther King Gandhi sense, but let's say like in a philosophical anthropology sense of how a social group effectively manages and mitigates violence as a matter of survival, right? So it's not about a political end. It's not like religions have a inherent emancipatory nonviolent. That's not the claim, you see. It's rather that they've found a way to achieve a social homeostasis, because that's ultimately what sacrifice is about for Girard, right? So you can see why Girard is a figure who gets quite annoyed at modernity or at postmodern life, because he feels that there's something that's missing around a knowledge and an appreciation of precisely the necessity of sacrifice, right? And so here I think it's an issue of repression of sacrifice, I feel. Anyways, okay, so let's hop into this. So he starts off with this notion of the dual idea of a ritual sacrifice, and starts off immediately, as I mentioned before, with the critique of Mauss and Huber. And again, the argument here is that for them, sacrifice is kind of deprivileged. It's not the main operating logic, and it is rendered as an imagined or an imaginary thing. But Girard will say here that, on the contrary, sacrifice contains an element of mystery. And he's also, as you know, written a prior book to this on a theory of literature, which is really interesting because he's taking the same formula, but he's applying it to like a canonical study of great literature from like Homer on through modern writers, including Shakespeare and Cervantes. So for example, in Don Quixote, he wants to make a claim that literature is superior to philosophy because literature is capable of identifying the object of rivalry at the core of the mimetic relation in a more direct way than philosophers have the humility to identify. And so that's kind of like one of his operations in that text. I haven't read that text, but I was reading his interviews on it, and that's sort of how he frames it. It's kind of an interesting project.
What's the name of that text?
Oh yeah, what is the name? The first one. Let's see here, sorry. It is.
It's called Deceit, Desire in the novel, I think.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Thank you.
So I think, that would be probably useful for us to possibly examine and see if there's aspects of that text which we want to isolate and consider. Okay, so now here he's getting into the question of recent studies suggest the physiology of violence varies little from one individual to another, from one culture to another. So again, he's entering into this claim that there is a higher logic of sacrifice, and we don't need to worry about these kinds of things that Levi-Strauss would worry about. Like, for example, is the Oedipus complex operating, for example, across all cultures? And the answer is no. The answer is there are some cultures which actually are not subjected to it, right? That's not true with sacrifice. Sacrifice for Girard is operative, right? And I don't know if anybody in anthropology on this meeting has wishes to debate that claim. So here he says violence is often has its reasons. It's often irrational. Now, here you'll see this notion, violence itself will discard them if the initial object remains persistently out of reach and continues to provoke hostility. Again, that's the idea that I was pinpointing before of the initial object. What is that? When unappeased, violence seeks and always finds a surrogate victim. So this is interesting to me because he's not saying that it's necessarily a conscious operation of society or of groups. It's based on misunderstanding, the identification of surrogate, but it's also, he says, based on identification, which is that a surrogate should resemble that victim from which it is standing in the place of. That's an interesting point that comes up later. Okay, then he moves on to Joseph Meister, who's familiar with this thinker? He's referenced a lot. I've actually never read Meister. Has anyone have a familiarity with him before we look at this? No, okay. You've also probably seen him mentioned quite a lot. And here he is showing obviously the contrast between animal sacrifice and human sacrifice, right? And while there are different logics, Girard wishes to suggest that they're pretty close to one another. And he's giving examples now from ethnology, from different tribes in the Upper Nile region. And let's see here.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is he making an argument that all sacrifice must have a resemblance with the person that is sacrificing? Like, there are so many religions where sacrifice is not like a human or an animal, but like, for example, money could be sacrificed, or people when they stop eating, how do I say that in English? They do, I forgot the
Fasting?
word, but yes, they do fasting. Like the lack of food is the sacrifice, or is the argument that he's making that all sacrifice must have a resemblance with the person, or is not?
It's not a necessary. It's not necessary. I like to think of it like concentric circles. And so you have in the example of the sacrifice in the Islamic tradition of Abraham and Ishmael, you have the relationship prior to that of Cain and Abel. And this is, so there's a continuation. And then you have the interjection of an animal to satisfy as a surrogate for the son. So there are these, but what would have been the closest circle would have been the execution and sacrifice of the boy, because it's the most valued object. Yet there is a kind of flexibility when you introduce animal sacrifice, which is not necessarily always based on the logic of resemblance, but it is insofar as he says that the animal often is the one who has the most human-like characteristics. So it's actually good to kill the smartest animal, you see.
This is something Freud also talks about in relation to sacrifice of animals in particular, and Agamben also talks about this as sort of a way to defer from patricide. Yeah. So the father is sort of symbolically killed in some of these ways, and that obviously is encouraged perhaps or repressed by the children or the sons in particular.
Yeah.
And so having that kind of a sacrifice sort of leads to a feasting time, and it's a time where the sons can sort of take the glory. So there is a interesting aspect to that, I think.
100%. And I love this move he makes here, where he says, look, Maestre was wrong. Good night. Maestre was wrong to moralize the idea. It's not, and this is Girard's structuralism here. I like this point. Mm-hmm. You'll see what I've highlighted. It's not a moral question. Rather, society is seeking to deflect upon a relatively indifferent victim, a sacrificable victim, the violence that would otherwise be vented on its own members, the people it most desires to protect. And so, you know, one of the things that's haunting the background here, apropos psychoanalysis, is what? is incest. And if you read Totem and Taboo, the prohibition on incest becomes, if you like, the first real social contract. And so while Freud is positing, and other Freudian disciples like Wilhelm Reich will even take the prohibition on incest much further and actually make the claim that at the level of unconscious desire, incest is still absolutely structural. Freud is not going to go that far as Reich, but nonetheless, I feel like that constitutive violence of incest has a clearer originary account in psychoanalysis than this. Again, this goes back to my main theme, which is, okay, what's the originary about, right? I really feel also like Levinas is an interesting interlocutor here. And those who may be or may not be familiar with Levinas, you sort of get this notion around the face of the other, a theory of constitutive violence, but for him, it's a turn to ontology, I feel like, and that it's kind of resolved vis-a-vis a connection between the social relation, the intersubjectivity, and ontology, as and so it becomes kind of solved, maybe better than Girard, is my intuition at the moment. Okay, the qualities that lend violence its particular terror, its blind brutality, the fundamental absurdity of its manifestations, have a reverse side. With these qualities goes the strange propensity to seize upon surrogate victims, to actually conspire with the enemy and at the right moment toss him a morsel that will serve to satisfy his raging hunger. The fairy tales of childhood in which the wolf, the ogre, or dragon gobbles up a large stone in place of a small child could well be said to have a sacrificial cast. Okay, so that makes sense. But what doesn't make sense to me is this phrase here. Good night. This idea of, I mean, it's almost a bit Weberian, like Max Weber, who makes this kind of claim about modernity, which you're probably familiar with, of this notion of disenchantment as a fundamental condition of modern life, that modernity is locked in a kind of interminable crisis of legitimacy, right? And so that animates institutions, whether that be the institution of a religion or of the family or of the governing apparatus. And it kind of sets a boundary, a limit point. And I feel like Girard is kind of saying something similar about that crisis, but he's obviously pulling from primitive societies. So maybe it's present there as well. Okay, so violence is not to be denied. This is a big theme for him. A society which is too unconscious of its own need to address internal violence goes awry. And so he then brings up the example of Cain and Abel, which I think most of us are probably familiar with. And he makes the claim that the conflict between them had to do with the absence of a sacrificial outlet. And we've already talked about the Muslim tradition. And then he introduces the figure of Jacob. So Jacob is an interesting thing, an interesting point to pause on. I wonder if anyone from the Jewish tradition might be interested in narrating a little bit of this, or even what your feelings were when you were reading it.
Like feelings, sorry.
No, like I'm less familiar with this Jacob and Esau narrative from my own like religious background, but I wonder if others who kind of grew up with these stories might wish to comment about them as we're reading them here.
You were asking about Jacob. I was trying to fix my internet.
Sure.
What was it that you were asking about Jacob?
Can you just give us can you give us a narration on its significance in the Judaic tradition, perhaps?
Oh, well, yeah, he was the third of the three forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he's considered the most perfect of the three. So like the final evolution. What first comes to mind is that story, the fascinating story with the speckled sheep, that his father-in-law was a kind of a trickster and trying to cheat him. And he found a way by using his mind and the blessings from God to engineer, essentially genetically engineer the kinds of sheep that were agreed he could keep and that they should give birth to less of the others. And then there's the famous story of the rock on the well. He reaches there looking for a wife, and he picks up this huge boulder on his own.
Interesting.
You're asking in context of?
No. That's helpful background. I was just looking, like, you see, part of the interest here is that he's narrating how certain objects can enter in, which are not exactly surrogate sacrificed objects, but like someone else said earlier, like fasting can function as a kind of more reified stand-in for the surrogate logic. And here it's the object of savory meat. If you see this paragraph here, it just goes to show that, like, there's kind of like a multiplicity of tactics that a society can use to fortify itself from the internal violence impulse, right? And then he says, two sorts of substitutions are telescoped here. That of one brother for another, and that of an animal for a man. Only the first receives explicit recognition in the text. However, this first one serves as the screen upon which the shadow of the second is projected. Once we've focused attention on the sacrificial victim, the object originally singled out for violence fades from view. Sacrificial substitution implies a degree of misunderstanding. Its vitality as an institution depends on its ability to conceal the displacement upon which the right is based. You know, that is really interesting for me because in the Islamic faith, which I'm pretty familiar with, you know, the pilgrimage is actually in part a reenactment of the abandonment that Hajar, who was a kind of concubine wife for Sarah, she and her child were left abandoned, Ishmael, who is actually the first progenitor of the Muslim people, right? He founds the Muslim people. But she has an intervention from God while she is dying of thirst in the desert. And that miracle creates the impetus or the inspiration for the pilgrimage. That's part of it. And then the achievement of arriving at the pilgrimage site in Mecca is a story of father-son reconciliation, because Abraham will reconcile that abandonment. Yet Hajar is not mentioned in the Quran. Her name is not mentioned. So it seems to me that Girard would benefit, or that rather his theory of the surrogate very much applies to Hajar. For a number of reasons, actually. That would be an interesting thing to study. If anyone's interested in that, there's an incredible book called Islam and Psychoanalysis, which actually analyzes Hajar as the central figure of the Islamic faith, precisely because of her sort of repressed status within the foundation of the faith. Anyways.
And he talks about Isaac and Jacob here,
Yes.
or with Esau, who was being sacrificed in his formulation, but Isaac himself was the subject of the Akedah, where Abraham agreed to slit his throat on the altar,
Yeah.
and then the substitution for the substitution. There was a goat was caught in the bushes, and God said no, with Hajar as well.
Yeah.
God commanded him to, you have to pick a side. Listen to what she says.
Right.
He didn't want to, right? So it was a sacrifice for him.
It's so funny how this crazy movie Midsummer is such a Girardian film. If you think about it, right? Has anyone seen that movie?
It's a new movie, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's all about sacrifice.
Yeah, I know of it, but I haven't seen it.
Oh, you like, now that we're reading this book, it's like mandatory we all watch this movie. Oh my God.
I tried to see if the director was consciously Girardian on YouTube. I couldn't find
Did
anything
you?
about it.
Oh, that's funny. Oh, that's hilarious. Okay. And then we get to
Jacob actually, he also sacrifices 7 years of his life, rather than abandon his first unwanted wife.
yeah.
But there's a reason why he picks the story of Isaac, because clearly there's many instances in the first few chapters of Genesis.
Right. So here you're actually looking at the role of deity, or the logic of a deity within a sacrifice. And you'll see this point here where he's critiquing Levi-Strauss. And this is what I was saying about this notion of the realm of imagination. And that, in fact, it's very faulty. So this is like key points if you want to take a note on this. I feel like he's able, or he's confident to make a structural account of sacrifice, which exceeds a logic of innocence or guilt, because oftentimes we intuitively look at sacrifice like, I don't know, like all of those movies about the Roman times. It's around the dispensation of justice, right? Here, he's able to enter into something, a discourse beyond morality. Therefore, he's able to subtract its logic from the specificities of a given time. So you can see why it's a quite streamlined account. I like that. And he says, the entire institution of sacrifices is relegated by most modern theorists to the realm of imagination. The approach of Huber and Mao leads to the judgment of Levi-Strauss in La Pensée Savage. Because sacrificial rites have no basis in reality, we have every reason to label them meaningless. So I didn't know that for Levi-Strauss, sacrifice is meaningless. Does anybody else who's maybe more familiar with Levi-Strauss feel like that might be hyperbolic for Girard to say that? I'm thinking, Levi, maybe you could help us with that.
I just read 2 works by him. I know nothing.
So in this work he references by Levi-Strauss, The Savage Mind in English. Yeah. It's been a couple years since I read it, but that was not the impression that I had. In fact, Levi-Strauss returns to sacrifice, and specifically the image of blood in sacrifice, which Girard is evoking later on here, specifically to try to understand the meaning of oppositions of blood, of menstrual blood, in relation to particular kinds of sacrifice, when a particular kind of animal might be eaten or not eaten, depending on when particular women in the tribe are going through a menstrual cycle. And unfortunately, I don't have the book with me right now. Otherwise, I would have gone to it. But I don't know if that's a very close reading of Levi-Strauss.
No. I think that's very helpful. The point is that to Levi-Strauss, as I understand what Girard is saying, it can be reduced to the logic of how the deity object is operating within the group. Okay, so therefore you cannot quite extract something beyond that specific operator. You see what I mean?
Yes.
And Girard is basically saying that you can, that it's actually foolish to analyze the sacrifice merely from the standpoint of the role of the deity and its commandment on the people to do it, and so on and so forth. So I think that's kind of what he's saying. And then, but the strong point he's making is that sacrifice itself has no logic for Marcel Mauss and for Claude Lévi-Strauss. It's unto itself, right? And for Girard, it obviously does. I think that's a sufficient way to state it. Now, I like this point here. It requires a certain degree of misunderstanding. They do not comprehend. So there's, I wonder if it's disavowal, like the famous Marxian commodity fetishism disavowal. Maybe in some sense it is. The theological basis. And what does that mean? That means transcendence. So Girard will later say that modernity is suffering from a decline of transcendence. And that is the whole thesis of Weber's disenchantment, okay? So you should remember that, because a society which is, unconnected to the transcendent is a society for which mimetic contagion is, disharmony and instability. They're prone to that. I think is kind of a claim that he's making here. He says here, interpreters who think they question the primacy of the divine sufficiently by declaring the whole affair imaginary may well remain the prisoners of the theology they have not really analyzed. The problem really becomes, how can a real institution be constructed on a purely illusory basis? It can't. I think I follow him on that point. Instead of rejecting the theological basis outright, qua abstraction, let us expose its assumptions to a critical examination. Let's just make a side point here. If you read a figure who's a Girardian, who's very brilliant, genius writer, Jean-Pierre Dupuy, he's like a contemporary French commentator who's written the most on Lacan and Girard. He wrote a book on the question of the sacred and the status of the sacred. And it's really refreshing to read him. I'll share this book in the Dropbox with you, because it's this point that he understands about religion. And there is a tendency, it's a positive tendency, of not so much the neoliberal libertarian thing, but this is a positive tendency of Girardians to kind of come to the table and actually say, look, we know something about religion that you don't, right? And we know about the necessity of religion and its omnipresence in some sense. And Dupuy is really, really smart with that. And I think that's what Girard is saying here, is that a lot of commentators have really not saw the theological as a foundation of social harmony. It's the foundation of a real act of a given institution, right? So I think that's a really nice point. Then he moves on to discuss this guy, Godfrey Leinhardt, who has, and Victor Turner, and I have read Victor Turner, really interesting kind of anthropologist figure. And he finds a lot of simpatico connection here with the way that these figures, these guys will theorize sacrifice. And here's an interesting point. Now, okay, this is interesting. Now he's kind of moving to the level of what does the victim substitute satisfy? And the sacrifice, he says, serves to protect the entire community from its own violence. We've already seen that. And it prompts the entire community to choose victims outside of itself. Okay, we've seen that. The elements of dissension scattered throughout the community are drawn to the person of the sacrificial victim and eliminated, at least temporarily, by its sacrifice. It's interesting. If we turn our attention from the theological superstructure of the act, from an interpretive version of the event that is often accepted as a final step, we quickly perceive yet another level of religious discourse. This has to do with the social function of the act. Okay. Yeah, I mean, he's sort of repeating it. This common denominator is internal violence, rivalry. So, okay, so this is nice. Now, I remember in the notes, I made a nice point here. This second function is what Freud calls sublimation, by the way. In Civilization and Its Discontents, what Freud pinpoints about sublimation is that a healthy society is one in which sublimating potential is ever present for subjects. And what that is the capacity to process collective antagonisms, right? In other words, to kind of, if you think about like repression, like, I don't know if you've ever traveled to a repressive society. Has anyone ever traveled to a society that you would characterize as repressive? You know, you feel it, right? You can tell that there's an abundant, palpable sense, and like there's a super egoic thing that you enter into. And even though you're kind of detached, you can't help but also feel repressed, you know? Has anyone ever had an experience like that?
I think all societies are repressed in some level, and depending on your notion of what a repressed means, you could say that even Europe or the United States or any other countries that we consider free are repressed in some aspects. So it really depends a lot on your views on what a repressed means.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I wasn't meaning to suggest that there's a post-repressive society. However, I do take quite seriously the contemporary psychoanalytic argument that the injunction to enjoy creates a different organization of superegoic repression than the kind of more traditional model. And so therefore, repression is brought about through a much more desubjective process. It's actually as a result of our own hedonism in some sense. This is like Lacan's whole point on the Marquis de Sade, which is Marquis de Sade had a vision of society which is absolutely beyond repression. And Lacan actually shows that even in that society of a complete laissez-faire exchange, right, based on the injunction to enjoy purely of all social contracts, repression would still return, you see? So I fully agree with you. However, what I was suggesting is that there is an experience one can have of going back to a traditionally patriarchal society, for example, or authoritative military culture. And you can witness that.
I noticed the difference between the state of Ohio and the state of Arizona. They're very different in that same sense, just much more nuanced, quite honestly.
Which one's more repressed?
Ohio, by far. I call it over-administrative, but it's palpable.
Very.
I thought for sure Arizona's more racist by 10 times.
Yes, Arizona is more the Wild West, where there are no rules. You make them up as you go along, and more power to you. And Ohio is more like, no, we don't do that, and we've never done that. And if you do that, you're gonna have a penalty. That's what I notice.
Yeah,
it's certainly not as severe as you.
So I think though, like we're getting off kilter. I think that's a beautiful example. However, repression is not the issue at play here, because you can have a stability, you can have a harmony and still have a repressive apparatus. You see my point? The idea of a substitutive sacrifice is not necessarily going to ameliorate repression. All it is giving an outlet to the buildup of everyday antagonisms, which are, I don't know if you like, they're naturalized. They're a natural part of subjective and intersubjective life, right? So yeah, it's not a utopic vision that like, oh, the human being is born into a kind of, a clean slate where things like rivalries and envy are non-existent. I mean, I think if anything, Girard is a cold realist, if there ever was one, about the status of the human being as a narcissistic subject, right? As sort of fundamentally born into a kind of condition of having a propensity for mimetic desire to obtain the other's possession and all of that, right? We'll get to that later, though. Okay, so it's about, please.
I was going to ask if he's going to talk more about the judicial system in the next chapters, and if
Which
he's
one?
going to explain. If Girard is going to talk more about the judicial system.
Oh yeah, no, he talks about it in this.
Sorry, the judicial system. Yeah.
He talks about the judicial system in chapter 1. So we'll get to that shortly. If we get to it. It comes in a few pages.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you read chapter 1, he mentions how the modern period will introduce the judicial system as the harbinger of the dispensation of justice, but it's not the case that the judicial system necessarily satisfies the element of sacrifice or the necessity of sacrifice. Still kind of remains a problem, okay?
Yeah, we saw that in the first chapter, but I wanted to know if he's going to go deeper into that in the rest of the book, or if he's going like to make a case for that.
Oh, I'm not sure.
No.
We'll see.
Okay.
Okay, so he's moving along here. In most societies, from the Jewish to the Greek, the sacrificial victims are almost always animals. Human victims are substituted for the individuals who are directly threatened by violence. Okay. And then here he gets into the example of Euripides's Medea, as I mentioned before. And again, I just felt like this issue of precisely, well, I just feel like this analysis is a little bit scant. I don't want to get too much into it. In part because I was recently reading about Lacan's reading of Medea in his later work, and I was far more compelled by his gloss on the significance of Medea than I am with this. So we can kind of put that to the side if that's all right. Here he says, in a general study of sacrifice, there's little reason to differentiate between human and animal victims. And here's this issue of resemblance, okay? When the principles of the substitution is physical resemblance between the vicarious victim and its prototypes, the mere fact that both victims are human beings seems to suffice. Thus, it's hardly surprising that in some societies, whole categories of human beings are systematically reserved for sacrificial purposes. And I made a note in the margins here that, I was thinking one category of humans, at least in the American context, who have been sacrificed and for whom their deaths, in a true sense, have no outlet for proper mourning or for proper, like they remain a kind of homo sacer status. And I would claim that that group of people is precisely the deaths of despair, the drug overdose pandemic. I don't know if you felt the same way. I mean, like, obviously you have the situation of the murder of Black people by the state, which is an absolute atrocity. Yet that atrocity is valorized, is mourned, and mourned very well, mourned collectively in a very healthy way, if you think about it, through protest, through riot, and so on. Whereas, can you give me an example of a nonprofit organization that really addresses this issue? I mean, it's only been in the last year that you have some lawsuits against the big pharma companies. But
there is victims of addiction, some kind of an org like that.
Sure.
They don't do much.
Yeah, it's just not visible. You see what I mean? It's like, it's almost as if like those deaths don't have the same, what I'm trying to say is that they almost fall into this category here. Systematically reserved for sacrificial purposes in order to protect other categories.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder about that. I'm just saying, wonder, because like the pharmacon in the Greek society was like a certain race of people who are destined to have no formal inclusion in the social order. Therefore, their expungement is neither here nor there. And so in Marxist literature, this is what we call lumpen proletariat. So in Marxist literature, this status, this category is a structural feature of capital, right? You don't have a capitalist system without the existence of the lumpen. And obviously Marx himself was not really a fan of lumpen proletariat. It would take the post-colonial and colonial thinkers like Frantz Fanon to absolutely valorize and recognize the revolutionary agency of the lumpen, right? But Marx did not think in industrial capitalism that lumpen proletariat could possess the agency of revolutionary agency, right? So they remained a pure, like, a pure exclusion from labor, right? So I feel like in capitalism, this lumpen category would link there. To what extent are they sacrificial victims? I'm not sure. I don't know.
I am.
Please go ahead.
I'm sure. Yeah, I'm certain that the leaders of our society are well aware, and it's not only when in heroin overdoses, but the poor, etc.
Yeah, I guess that's true, Kyan, but like, what's the higher? I think this actually becomes an ambiguity. And I think Girard will link on that ambiguity, which is a society which has separated itself from the kind of necessary impulse, such as our own, I think kind of goes astray in a certain sense. So I think that there's like there's a confusion around the modern function of how sacrifice actually is operating. And I think this is something we should be thinking about as we read this text. I think it's too early for us to like speculate. You know what I mean? We're just putting our feet in the water here.
Isn't it? Is that why you raised it? It's precisely because it goes unnoticed.
Yeah. No, I think so. I mean, I also think that, the way in which the bourgeoisie in the United States treated the Bernie Sanders campaign is another example of of something which was a covering over, which was a kind of reaction to an exposure which the ruling class, wasn't prepared to confront, right? So in that sense, they opportunistically use the Black Lives Matter movement as a surrogate for that covering themselves. Now, the Black Lives Matter movement itself is an absolutely, righteous and, in my view, emancipatory effort. However, I think by the ruling class standards, it's eligible to be used as a surrogate for something that it's not. You see, like there's a lot of manipulation that goes into the valorizing of that by certain class interests. And it really ingratiates me personally. I don't know if you feel the same way. Anyways.
I would love to hear more about it because it's the first time that I see an American exposing an argument like this regarding the Black Lives Matter. It's pretty interesting.
I just think there's a lot of disingenuousness around people that support it. Yeah, like in my neighborhood, I live in a kind of mixed neighborhood in Washington, D.C. with a fair amount of wealthy people. And, you just have to be a little suspect of anyone that joins a social justice movement without any sacrifice themselves. Like they have all of this investment, symbolic investment. But when push comes to shove, what are you willing to sacrifice? I don't think that they're willing to sacrifice much, They're willing to offer a performative, a kind of a rhetorical position vis-a-vis the public sphere, right? To talk about it, to elevate its visibility, elevate its representation, elevate its awareness. But it stops there, right? Because they still hold a view of the subject as an entrepreneurial, liberated, libertarian subject, right? So racism is bad only because it holds entrepreneurs down from fulfilling the entrepreneur function. And if we can elevate all boats to become entrepreneurs, we can create something close to equality for the bourgeois liberal, right?
So it lacks a deeper thought on the subject of racism and why it is bad.
It lacks a view of antagonism. It misplaces, it misunderstands. Like when Girard talks about this notion of antagonism above, I claim that it's like a partial touch on it leaves a number of antagonisms untouched, right? So it's not a full investment. It's like a partial, I claim. And like that partial effort seems to me like very much lacking.
I think Zizek has a thought that is kind of similar, but I'm not very good at remembering things. But maybe next time we can.
Who does?
I think Zizek, Slavoj Zizek.
Oh, Zizek, yeah, Mm-hmm. Sure.
So I have a question. Like, if America had been on the couch for a couple of years, would that mean that they had been more willing to work with Bernie Sanders?
That's a beautiful question, Kyle. Oh man. Oh no. Well, I mean, my views on Bernie Sanders are maybe different than most. I mean, I take a Bajuian line on politics, which is I'm kind of a maximalist in the sense that, like, World War II really happened because of Bolshevik revolution, and the wars happened because of a crisis within the Russian Revolution itself. It was an emancipatory point, and it was this point at which all other events can be mapped.
So you think that the Bolshevik revolution could have been done differently, or could?
Of course, it could be done differently. My point is that it created a panic within the liberal capitalist order, right? Precisely because it's introducing a lack, a wound, a void, which is the social order is not able to confront. So Bernie Sanders is just an effect of the protests after the Great Depression of 2008. That's all he is. He's just the formalization of the emancipatory demand of Occupy Wall Street. Because before 2008, Bernie Sanders was some goofball up in wherever he's from. Nobody took him seriously. Mm-hmm. But it's not Bernie Sanders the man. He's just so happens to be a pass, a kind of a trace of this maximal event, That's how I read it. And he therefore congealed a new set of antagonisms, which the social order was not prepared to confront. Right? That's all he did. And unfortunately, he did it in a way which was slightly weak, slightly not concerned with ascertaining power, and so on and so forth. So like Trump is not like a real fascist, Sanders is not like a real socialist interested in power. And we hope that the next iteration, we hope it will not produce a real fascist, and but we hope that it will produce maybe a real socialist that will take things further, you know? That's my kind of read. I feel like Sanders was a vessel, in other words. I also furthermore do not believe that the symptom of America's ruling class can be psychoanalyzed away. I think actually the thesis of Marx around revolutionary socialism is a correct thesis, which is why I'm really not a social democrat myself. In other words, the only type of socialism is revolutionary socialism, in part because the symptom of class struggle is an interminable symptom. It's not something that we can circumvent, like Lacan calls traversing of that fantasy. It's not something we can traverse through elections and through instruments created by the ruling class. I think it actually requires a different treatment. That's my, anyways, I don't want to get too far off our focus here, but I'm freestyling with you all. It's fun. Okay. Sacrifice in two categories, human and animal, has led to a ritualistic sense. This is based on a value judgment on the preconception that the category of victim, the human being, is quite unsuitable, while another category is eminently sacrificable. Okay, is that true? Okay. It's not a question of rejecting the value judgment here that the animal is superior to the human, on which this misunderstanding is based, but of putting it, so to speak, in parentheses, of recognizing that as far as the institution is concerned, such are purely arbitrary. Okay. All victims, animal or human, must, here he is, again, he's so structuralist. I love this. Must be treated in the same fashion if we wish to apprehend the criteria by which the victims are selected. Very interesting. How do you guys feel about this uber structuralism that he's giving us here? Is it kind of nice, or does it feel a little too heavy? I don't know.
I kind of look at it both
We
ways.
kind of
I think it is nice on one hand because it's very descriptive and very certain, but I'm not sure it's inclusive of everything. It certainly adds value to me to understand where he's aiming. I think that's the most important thing.
So this is super significant point on resemblance. Resemblance is there. It's not necessary. But he says, quote, this resemblance must not be carried out to the extreme of complete assimilation, or it would lead to disastrous confusion. This is why you have in some ancient societies a prohibition on twins. I like that point he makes. There is a prohibition on twins. I actually didn't know that. But you see, it's the same logic, which is that in primitive societies, you know, there's a kind of singularity of the name, a singularity of the individual, which cannot be repeated, and which so it's very interesting. In the case of animals, this issue of resemblance is kind of obviously no longer an issue, so it makes it animals are in some sense better for this operation. Okay, all of that's interesting. I wish I had my notes from before. I do apologize, everyone. These things happen though. Is it possible to detect a unifying factor in this disparate group? So the disparate group here are the plebs, the pharmacos. So this is an interesting question. Is there a unifying factor in this group which is eligible to be sacrificed. Prisoners of war, slaves, pharmacos. In many primitive societies, children who have not yet undergone the rites of initiation have no proper place in the community. Their rights and duties are almost non-existent. What we are dealing with, therefore, are exterior or marginal individuals incapable of establishing or sharing the social bonds. This is like the incels, right? Their status as foreigners or enemies, their servile condition, or simply their age prevents these. This is like inceldom. Maybe the incels are the new surrogate victims.
I have a quick comment on that. This is one thing I was thinking of when you're talking about the deaths of despair with like drug overdoses. And I was thinking, especially with these remarks here, you could probably generalize that to the chronically institutionalized as such, especially at a young age, going past even like prison systems into like mental health asylums or eating disorder clinics or drug rehabs in general. Because just the interactions that I've had of people who from a young age go in and out of that a lot, that seems to be a key thing about how they relate to society, is kind of being stripped away from the ability to go like through the rituals that designate you as like a standard member of that society.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, that's interesting here that you make that point, because once you get to feudal societies, you obviously have the figure of the fool, and why the beggar or the fool or the outcast has a kind of homologous relationship to the king is a very nice point, which is that the king in some sense is an outsider. You even think of like Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, the image of the cover of that book. You see that the king, in order to be the one who executes the question of sovereignty of the people, must be both a foot in the people, but also obviously a foot out from the people. It has this like dual status, the king's two heads, right? So that's a very nice point. I think you're right. I think that there is a important subversive point. But you know, if we read Agamben in the Homo Sacer series, you realize his argument there is that the condition of inclusion, exclusion, what he calls like throne biopolitical existence, which is beyond just Marxist alienation, is beyond that, is much more totalized for humanity, right? So there is a kind of creeping lumpenization or proletarianization of human life in Agamben's kind of apocalyptic framing of the condition of modern life. And he uses the example of the Guantanamo camps of the Muslim terrorist as the fact that irrespective, I mean, okay, Islam's the second largest religion, and any so-called person based on their name, you know how that worked, right, during the War on Terror. If you had the same name as Muhammad Atta or whoever, it's incidental, you're thrown into the camp. You see my point? So there is a certain potential pharmaconization of humanity. Well, in this case, vis-a-vis the imposition of the state. So anyways, I don't mean to divert too much there. Okay, so that's the king and the fool. And then it's interesting to note that some African societies, the king will be sacrificed. I like that. The role of women versus animals. Okay, let's see here. For the act they're about to commit elaborate. Okay. So he then says, it is the entire species considered as a large family clan that the sacrificers beseech not to seek vengeance. By incorporating the element of reprisal into the ceremony, the participants are hinting broadly at the true function of the rite, the kind of action it was designated to circumvent, the desire to commit an act of violence of those near us cannot be suppressed without a conflict. I see. So here again, can somebody help me with this? Why do we have a desire to commit an act of violence to those near us? Why must that impulse be suppressed? Has he answered that question? Or am I missing something here?
I don't know if he's answered it. I think it's supposed to be something that we assume to be true.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. Does that make any sense to you intuitively?
Yeah, it's just he takes it as obvious.
Is it?
Yeah, I think so. We can't.
How do you theorize that?
You see, right now, for me to speak, you have to stop speaking. We can never stand in the same place.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, I tend
Not
to
if we live in Italy.
like. I'm sorry. I
Not
tend
if
to
we live
like.
in- No, sorry.
Okay.
It's-
Well, I
Go
was going to say I tend to like Lacan's sort of definition of sort of violence here, I guess you'd say.
Yeah.
And I think what he points out is there's this relationship between our subconscious and our conscience, or conscious, where that's sort of a violent relationship. So just by virtue of sort of existing and you know, finding meaning and surviving and all these different things we do, there's a violence in separating out what we do from what we don't do.
Yeah.
And what all these other things that are there. So I think there is this precariousness of existence that sort of allows for life to be sort of very precious, which means that really the conditions for life are very sort of dominating, and potential, all sorts of potential tragedies could strike at any moment.
Yeah. I like that. I think though Lacan gives us an answer to the constitutive violence, and he does it through the loss that comes from the maternal bond, and the conflict, which is constitutive of what he calls the imaginary, is a conflict around the achievement of an imagined wholeness of the self and the construction of the ego, right? And it makes very much sense to take the Kojevian battle of prestige, right, of the master slave, and to sort of superimpose that as the logic that governs the imaginary. Because then if we do that, we can see in the ways in which otherness, as the injunction of first the parental, but then the social and so on otherness, that is making a demand for your wholeness, presents a conflict, right? Which goes on. And then later you have Oedipus, right? But that all is very clear from the mirror stage, or early position. But with Girard, like, we haven't got there yet, maybe. And I'm frustrated we haven't. I feel like maybe he should start with that. But I think maybe he's not doing that because he wants to come out of the gates with this strong theory of a structural theory of sacrifice. You know, I don't know. Okay. Cool. So all of that sounds very good. Here's the sublimation point. When internal strife, previously sublimated by means of sacrificial practices, rises to the surface, it manifests itself in inner family vendettas or blood feuds. Oh yeah, sorry. This is where he's making a shift to basically say, okay, so what does all of this say about our current modern life? And he's saying, you know, look, we're not a society which thinks that it needs sacrifice, right? Yet, of course, we have violence. So he's sort of building an argument here, which gets to your point. What was your first name again? A.L.?
Is that Ariel?
Ariel.
Ariel.
Sorry,
Yes.
thank you. I appreciate it. He's getting to your point, about the modern judiciary and so on. Because he wants to say that the concept of the judiciary is actually not something around quelling sacrifice. It's actually something around revenge. And the operating issue is revenge.
Mhm.
The maintenance of revenge in society, okay?
Mhm.
You know, one of the things he doesn't mention in this text, which I think Levi and others who study anthropology could help us with, is precisely gift societies. Societies of the gift elevate the gift as the primary modality of exchange, precisely to mitigate and put an end to revenge, to cycles of revenge.
Mm.
And so the logic of the potlatch, for example, is precisely to give a gift for which you mitigate in advance the possibility of a reprisal. So you take a structural assumption of antagonism. Like, there's an enemy over the other side of the river that we've never met. We're nomads. We're just going to assume that they want us dead. So our first act is to overwhelm them with a gift. And in fact, that overwhelm status is very important. It must be excessive. It must be something which they cannot return adequately. Because that surplus overwhelm of the gift cannot produce a counter gift. So we now have power over them through gift. The gift is actually a force of power, you see? And actually in gift societies, you can actually have wars precisely over this question of the surplus of the ungiftable exchange. So anyways, go ahead.
So the gift is not much different from violence.
No, not at all. I mean, the gift is an interesting way of exchange because it presupposes the constitutive nature of violence, and it has a solution to it, right? It proposes a solution, and the point is that the solution is in the gift, which cannot be reciprocated. A non-reciprocal gift. That's the key. When I give you an object for which you cannot meet it in return, I somehow have a power over you, which is non-violent power. Now, Kojin Karatani says that this is the origin of religion. That when you get to this kind of level of sophistication, right? Girard's going to offer a different proposal.
Okay, so because that was much more clarifying in terms of the gift, but Girard's gonna, in terms of the sacrifice, he's gonna go elsewhere because this is helpful to see that the violence is baked in.
Yeah.
And they're making a move around with the violence that they assume.
Yeah.
That's not how it works with sacrifice.
Yeah, because part of this also is the question of sovereignty. So once you have sovereigns, the management of gift exchange changes its logic. It's no longer non-reciprocal gift exchange is no longer operative, and instead you have exchange governed by the sovereign. This is what Karatani calls mode B, and the logic is completely different. It's based on plunder and redistribution. So your control of a population is based on your capacity to plunder and then redistribute the resources. But in the mode A, the first mode, which is reciprocal gift exchange, that's the operating mode by which religion seeks a kind of glorious return. Anyways, this is actually something Cade is familiar with because we studied Karatani's Structure of World History, which explicates all of this very nicely.
That's what's the
Could you
title?
give an example?
This is a book which is called The Structure of World History by Kojin Karatani, the Japanese Marxist. And it's incredible book. So it's basically pulling together of philosophical anthropology, theory of religion, a new way to read Marxism, I mean, just so much. It's very rich. World systems theory, it's tethering with world systems theory, proposing a completely different model for world systems theory. And then it's kind of ending up with a kind of claim that Kant is the first Marxist. Because Kant realized a mode of exchange which adhered to that mode I just described to you through his notion of categorical imperative. And that the categorical imperative can only function in a society governed not by commodity logic, but by reciprocal exchange. So Kant, there is no Kant in capitalism. I love it. Okay. It makes the liberals livid, trust me. Okay, now he's introducing revenge. Okay, the spirit of revenge, Perhaps because the only satisfactory revenge for spilt blood is spilling the blood of the killer. There is no clear distinction in the feud. Okay. Vengeance professes to be an act of reprisal, and every reprisal calls for another reprisal. Okay, vengeance then is interminable, infinitely repetitive. Every time it turns up, Curiously enough, it is in the very communities where the proscription is most strictly enforced that vengeance seems to hold sway. Even when it remains in the background, its role in the community unacknowledged, the specter of vengeance plays an important role in shaping. Okay. Okay, Okay, here we go. If men wish to prevent an interminable outbreak of vengeance, just as today we wish to prevent nuclear war, he says it's not enough to convince their fellows that violence is detestable, for it is precisely because they detest violence that men make a duty of vengeance. That's an interesting point. I like that point. What I think he means there is that a judicial approach to an eye for an eye, which is the kind of foundation of any judicial order, ultimately, whatever it tells itself, right, is not adequate for touching the question of originary violence. What is? I think the answer is obviously sacrifice. Has anyone seen, by the way, Succession, this new HBO series about the kind of Rupert Murdoch type family?
Oh yeah, great show.
It is a good. Have you noticed the theme of sacrifice returned in this show? Whenever there's a crisis, the father is always, the first point he makes is always that there must be a sacrificial. And it's very nice because he's very clear. He's very clear that it's arbitrary. It could be anyone. And then he says, let us deliberate on who it should be, right? But the point is that in order, kind of like the logic of gift exchange, in order to satisfy the masses for whom they have power over, it's the masses that need the sacrificial victim. So he possesses a kind of genius. And the other thing I like about that show, of course, is that he reads the social fabric through the lens of the most vulgar Marxist class analysis imaginable. It's very interesting point. He doesn't dilly-dally with any identity politics or anything like that. He just clearly gets to the point of control of resources and money. Okay, here it is, Ariel. The judicial system is introduced, and it's about managing vengeance. Okay. By definition, primitive societies only have private vengeance. That makes sense. In other words, they don't have an institution that manages that. That's fine. Okay. So then he's talking about the absence. Why is it absent? What is the effect of its absence on primitive societies? Okay. The parental group is the one that usually decides it. Okay. All right. The desire to find in primitive societies virtues equal to or superior to our own as regards the control of violence must not lead us to minimize differences. So we are currently at page 17, by the way, and it's already 6 minutes past the 2-hour mark. So maybe we should kind of pause here and make a note that we're where we are and pick it back up, because I want to respect everyone's time. I don't want to just stay on for ages and ages. Would that be okay if we paused for now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, cool. Well, this has been a nice start, y'all. I think 17 pages is pretty good. Although there's a lot left to go. And how do y'all feel about this text? I think it's pretty cool so far.
Yeah, I think it's great. It obviously brings up and touches a lot of areas that
Yeah.
are important.
Yeah, I think it'll be a good read. Does anybody have an interest in writing about Girard out of curiosity? Is there anybody that wants to, like, you know, take this further and do research and things of that nature?
I'd definitely be interested. I've used excerpts from this book before in a paper or two. And I don't know if anybody mentioned this before I jumped into the call, but I think the interest I've really got with reading this is with René Girard being Peter Thiel's mentor. I'm still trying to like find Girard's theories in his practices, like where's violence in the sacred and Palantar, that kind of thing.
Yeah. For sure. Okay, so Duncan had to bounce, Levi had to bounce, Joe had to bounce. Awesome. Yeah, and I'm really interested because I went to lunch with a liberal philosopher colleague of mine at Georgetown, and he's like, you know, you Lacanians should go apply to the Girard foundations, because, you know, Girard was at Stanford in Palo Alto, and all of his disciples see him, listen to some interviews about contemporary Girardians or from contemporary Girardians. And I tell you, man, they treat this guy like a master more than we treat our masters as masters, if that makes sense. So we should almost maybe try to invite one of them onto here and debate with them when we're done with this book. I really want to hear what they have to say, you know? I want to talk to a libertarian Girardian. I don't know about you. So let me stop this.